Well, hello and Happy New Year. I thought I would address a topic that's close to home for so many people, given the pandemic and my recent loss of a friend. That there's been so many deaths and people dealing with that loss. And as I mentioned before, one of the best ways of dealing with that loss is to talk directly to the person who's died, whether it's out loud or in your mind, and to fully express that, you know, when the sadness or the anger comes up, my sadness is telling me, I hate it that you're not here with me, and that's because I love that when you were here with me, and I'd love to have more time with you. Why would I like to have more time? Because, and then go through the list of all the things that you love doing and saying to them, I loved it when we did this, and really like looking at a treasure photo album, you go through that. So you really heal it, the loss, by focusing on what you're grateful for. And mainly, you're grateful for the time you had with them, and here's why, the whole list, and, let yourself dwell on that. But anyway, so the topic of life after death, is there, when you're communicating this to your departed loved one, is there something there, are they there in some form for you to communicate with? Are they receiving this? And ever since my profound, life-changing, mystical experience, spiritual experience, that was 25 years ago, for the past 25 years, I've had these experiences where I have felt the presence of a deceased loved one, of someone else, and in my case, with some of my own, my mother and my father both. But it was only after I had this profound opening that made it so I had that spiritual vision, in a way, and that what they call, there's clairvoyance, where you can see clearly. Clairvoyant, that's where it comes from. Clairaudient here, I haven't really had too many experiences with that, but there's also clairsentience, where you actually feel the energy come in. And what was interesting was, after I began having these experiences of a sensation of an energy, and I'll tell you about my first experience in a moment, of an energy coming through my back, almost like the size of a person, sensations of an energy, and then I would get thoughts or some type of communications. And so the first time this happened was shortly after my experience, my spiritual experience, and I was doing Reiki, which I'll go into another point. Reiki, again, I mentioned before, R-E-I-K-I. R-E-I is the syllable that's pronounced like the name Ray, like a man's name, R-A-Y. But R-E-I means universal, and Ki, K-I, pronounced like the key you use to open a door. That is energy, so universal energy. And that was a deeply healing, deeply relaxing, healing art of it was refound in Tibet by Mikao Usui back in the 1850s, a Japanese Buddhist monk. Anyway, I was doing some Reiki, and suddenly I had a picture off to the right in my mind of two people, a woman with blue dress with white polka dots, and the word came in white bobby socks, which really is a 1950s, 60s type of thing. And a man next to her who looked like he was around, the number came 36 years old. And it also almost reminded me of the painting American Gothic. The two farmers, the man and the woman standing there with bib overalls. So anyway, I see this, and I'm doing the Reiki. I'm standing behind the person, the receiver, behind a chair like this, and they're seated in front of me, and I have my hand sending the healing energy, and I have this picture, and I thought, gee, should I say anything? So I said, and I was doing it just for relaxation purposes, to help her relax, and just for soothing energy kind of experience. And I said, okay, I guess I'll say something. So I said, to the woman, I said, I'm getting a picture of a woman. And as soon as I acknowledged the picture, I felt this flood of energy come into me. If you've seen the movie Ghost with Whoopi Goldberg doing a reading of this with his family around, and she's sitting there, and suddenly the deceased husband pops into her back, and she looks at her at the wife and says, he speaks through her, "Honey, what'd you do to your hair?" So that visual of this sort of the soul jumping into her back was what I felt, and I suddenly filled with tears, and I had my hands, and I felt this immense love for the person in front of me. It wasn't my love for them; it was this other person's, and I felt myself tear up like I was watching a moving episode of Touched by an Angel or Highway to Heaven or some movie where there's this spiritual element and a reuniting of people that loved each other, some from the great beyond. And the words came, and I said, and she wants you to know she loves you very much, and she wants you to start believing in yourself. And so I said, Susan, what is that? And she said, that's my grandmother. And she said, I can smell her perfume. And I didn't have the olfactory sense of that coming in, but she did. And I said, well, and who's the younger man next to her? Is that your grandfather? And she said, no. She said, and she sensed it's the boy that I didn't call back in high school. One night, he called me. I didn't call him back. It was a friend. It wasn't a boyfriend. And that night he suicided. And I felt guilty ever since. So I did the therapy thing. I said, okay, picture him and tell him, how you feel. I'm sorry that I didn't call you back, and so forth and so on. And as she did this, I sensed in the corner of my room, it was like a dimly lit, my office was dimly lit. It was at night. And I could sense kind of a shadowy presence. And I kept getting the message like, let it go. It's okay. I know. To everything she said, it wouldn't have mattered if you called me back. It was all a healing to help her realize that this guilt she had carried and she was now 36 and they were 18 when it happened. And so I got that number 36 and I had no idea who it was or whatever. But that helped her release that guilt. And so that was the first time that I'd had sort of a communication with someone beyond in the afterlife. And then over the years, in studying more and more, the ancient tradition that we've been alluding to, that it can be found in both the Vedanta tradition from India, as well as in other places as well. But in this case, they talk about the subtle body, which is another way of describing what we might call the soul, that portion of the spirit that comes in and enlivens the body. As I've talked about before with my experience of re-experiencing my birth and finding myself, some part of that energy was in the little baby body, the fetal body, and something was out here, and that which was in would be what we'd call the subtle body, or I would call the embodied soul. So the idea is that when we die in the traditions, that subtle body, which is our thoughts, our sense of that first person knowing, sense of I, memories and all, depart the physical body as it then begins its process of the death process of finally decaying and so forth, so that this other energy type body, which is what people experience when they experience an out of body experience, which is another evidence of there is something to us. I am more than my physical body, and that's the mantra, that's the motto of the Monroe Institute, started by Bob Monroe many years ago. I am more than my physical body. And there at that institute, they explore consciousness, and people have experiences where they're out of their bodies. That is this energy body, this subtle body. And the subtle body is composed, and you experience your subtle body right now as I'm talking to you. That's your thoughts, that's your inner life. It's not just the life energy that's keeping your body alive. It's also your thoughts, your feelings, your emotions, your memories, your sense of an ego, of yourself as a person, a personality. All that is what is leaving. And in this case, this woman's grandmother had appeared, had come through me, and her personality and her feelings and her particular idiosyncrasies, her perfume and so forth, had come through, which is kind of amazing. And so recently I lost a good friend, Tony, and it's been happening often in the middle of the night, sometime around 3 or so, in that range, and I'll feel the person's essence, that subtle body, come into the room, and I might have a sense. I might not actually see it. I might just see a light, a ball of light or something, not really clear, just a sense, and I'll feel them come around and come through my back. And it's interesting to me that I would always find the energy coming through my back, that I'd be lying in bed, and instead of coming right down through your heart in the front and so forth, it was always coming through the back, and I never knew what to make of that. But as I felt that, I felt him come in, and I felt this almost like an effervescence, this overflowing joy, this champagne is the image I got, champagne bubbles, like he was really released and free. And that's all I got, basically, that he was okay, and I communicated that to his beloved wife. And one of the other times I'll tell you about, and there's quite a few over the last 25 years, was I was doing Reiki at a distance on a Hungarian doctor, and he was on his deathbed, and his stepdaughter was there, and I had tuned her to Reiki, which is the process, or trained her in Reiki, and she was doing Reiki directly over him in their home, and I was doing it many miles away. Well, he dies, and he was a dyed-in-the-wool scientific materialist. He would tell his wife, Gisela, there is no soul, there's just chemicals. I go back to earth, I go back to chemicals. He had that fundamental thing. He just was kind of anti any spirituality until he met me and he read my first book, 8 Steps to Love. And he began to have a little different thinking about that. But there was nothing in that book that went with what he found out of what he ended up saying. So he dies. And at the moment he dies, I later heard from his wife and his stepdaughter that a golden light, speckled light, kind of surrounded her, and a voice in the center of that light directed her to look back at his lifeless body lying on the couch right after the death rattle and the whole bit. And the voice that was his voice that she heard in her mind, I am free, I am free. He kept me locked up and didn't believe in me. And he was pointing her back to the body, which I would say the body and the thinking in that body, the body-mind, lying there. So he had a shift. His mind now was somewhat enlightened to the idea that he was something other than flesh, blood, and bone, which he maintained vehemently until the last couple of months of his life. But he wasn't completely convinced of himself having a spirit or a soul. And then he did what's often happens. He expressed his regrets and so forth, and how he was sorry he didn't show as much love as he felt for her, and his insecurities and so forth. But he spent about, my understanding was about 48 hours, she sensed him around the house. And then at the end of that, as she sensed him going up toward the vaulted ceiling, and she said, hey, where are you going? He said, I'm going to the place where you go to next to see where you're going after that. And he never read a spiritual book that had this material in it. And what he was talking about at the Monroe Institute, they call the park, the place where the souls go first, or a staging area before they go where they're going to go next, presumably for their learning or for various experiences and so forth. Or what Dr. Newton in his book, Life Between Lives, that between lifetimes, there is some evidence about reincarnation, and we'll get into that another time. But even Dr. Ian Stevenson at the University of Virginia, where I was, who met and knew Dr. George Ritchie, who I'm going to talk about at another point, about his near-death experience, and one of the first most miraculous ones. Anyway, he had 2,000 cases of children remembering past lives. So without getting into whether there are or aren't past lives, there was in this book a number of instances where Dr. Newton had regressed people back, taking their symptoms and hypnosis to the origin of them. And when he started to take them back, he found people going back to like an earlier lifetime. Like one case, a guy had pain in his side, and then we regressed him back. He had a memory of being stabbed in his side in World War I or something like that. But after that, he began to have one case after another where people were going to a space in between lives where they were just balls of light, like the soul was a ball of light, and different colors meant like different levels of spiritual growth and knowledge and so forth. Anyway, he would see them going back to this space between lives, and they didn't have the shape of a body, but like when a ghost, or when you see a person's deceased loved one, like I've had other experiences where they appear and they look like they did in life, but oftentimes younger and at their peak. And I remember reading that often people will show up at their prime, rather than show up, as what they were when they died in their 80s or something. They may show up like they're 29 or 30, like my mother showed up and I remember the number was 29 years old. So there is so many experiences I've had, and there's other literature, confirming that there is a life after death. Now, what else happens after that besides the fact that they can communicate with us? And oftentimes it has to be when we're in a place like I was, sleeping at 3 a.m, so my consciousness is at a receptive state, and there isn't too many noises or anything to interfere. Or when I was in my office and it was quiet and I was working with my patient. So it doesn't necessarily offer consolation for those of us who have lost loved ones, but it does give you a little something besides knowing how to work it through with gratitude, but also to feel okay about talking to them and speaking to them and saying what you feel. Now, if you're familiar with the near-death experience literature, a lot of times when people have their near-death experience, but they come back, they were able to report what it's like when they were clinically dead by all definitions medically, and they saw the deceased loved ones in the light, or sort of go to the light, going into the light that we tend to supposedly die into, and seeing deceased loved ones that are helping that soul transition to the other side. So there is some basis for us communicating with a deceased loved one. It's not so crazy as you might think to talk to them directly and then see what you get and notice what you feel, because you'll have synchronicities, which are meaningful emotional coincidences where, as my friend was talking about his father, he hadn't heard that song for a year since the father had died, and then suddenly the song starts to play. So in terms of coping with these losses, these immense amount of loss that people have had, loved ones through this pandemic, you can certainly consider communicating with that lost loved one and know that it's not just talking to thin air, that in fact there is a soul there is a subtle body that you may or may not be aware of that's receiving that information. And the Tibetan Book of Living and Dying's got a whole phenomenology, experientially based period after the death of the body of a way that they communicate with that deceased loved one and help him go through the stages of what they call the bardos. But we don't need to get into that. Just keeping it simple, just expressing that love and feelings that you had, and know that it can be beneficial. I just remember in the Tibetan Book of Living and Dying that the soul right after death is very sensitive, and it picks up our thoughts. And so if somebody is really unable to let go of that lost loved one, that the lost loved one will be picking up on that, and they'll be impeded in their movements to wherever they need to do next. They'll feel the need to stick around and be a ghost, if you will, So what we call a ghost is really that subtle body, which is again the mind, the intellect, the memories, the sense of ego of a self identified with this sort of body that's maybe looks a little bit like, if it manifests like, the physical body that they left behind, but oftentimes it one that looks like they did in their prime. So I offer that to you, and at some point I'm going to get back to what happened for me that made me more sensitive to this kind of thing. I'm going to tell you one other story before we stop today, and that is way back, again, it was about 23 years ago. I was in Los Angeles, and I was living there in West Hollywood, met a man who was a executive producer, one of the ones, of Ghost, the movie Ghost, with Patrick Swayze and Demi Moore. And so I met him, and I had moved back to the East Coast and lost touch with him. But he died, and right after he died, and I had heard that he died, right after that, I was staying. I was in the living room, and I was walking through. I was staying there with my aunt, and my aunt was watching in the afternoon, about 3 in the afternoon. She's watching the movie Ghost. So I was walking through the living room. I stopped and watched the scene where Patrick Swayze says, "Molly," something like this. "Molly, it's amazing. The love inside, you get to take it with you." And as I said that, I felt this energy again coming through the back, what I would call the back door of my heart, and coming in, and I got the message that it was Scott, and he wanted me to communicate to a friend I had out west that knew his girlfriend, to tell his girlfriend that when he had died of an overdose accidentally on drugs, and he wanted her to know he didn't do it purposely. He didn't do it on purpose. It wasn't suicide. It was an accident. And I felt him communicate that to me. And so I got on my email, went to send the email, and I felt the energy strongly coming through, the sensation of him and the urgency to get that message through. And so what a cool synchronicity that was. I mean, movie Ghost, he was somewhat of an executive producer, one of the ones where he had something to do with it. And there it was, and it was that moment that he had communicated with me. And so that's the times, these are the times where it was more just on an energetic basis. At another presentation, I'll be talking to you about when I actually saw physically what would be called that subtle body that would look fully like an actual person, as clear as you see me on the screen here. Is how I saw these